Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm honored to be here at the Ramsey Free Public Library. I'm honored to be talking about George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. And I also intend to make pointed comments about Thomas Jefferson, who I have a lower regard for. And I would rank them with Washington as the man of the highest character. Hamilton is in second place, then Madison, and in last place is a man of lower character, Thomas Jefferson. My name is Jan Blau. I'm really from New York City. The last 11 years I've lived here in Bergen County, New Jersey. And more than 15 years ago, I became very, almost obsessed with George Washington and everything about him, his childhood, his mother, his father, his half brother and sister, and the rest of his siblings. And it's a story that's not commonly written about. But I'm not here to talk about the life of Washington, but rather the battle of the founders, Washington and Hamilton against Jefferson and Madison. So, but the story of the American Revolution starts with George Washington. And George Washington had a very difficult mother. The historians have called her grasping, unreasonable, complaining, stingy, difficult, unsocial, acquisitive. And if you add it all up today, it's very clear to me that Mary Ball Washington had a personality disorder, a severe personality disorder. So this was a very difficult situation for Washington. Now, how did George Washington get this mother? He had a father, Augustine, and Augustine, like his son George, was always in motion. They were men of action. They were not, Washington was not a man of self-contemplation, but rather a man of accomplishments. He got up before dawn, he wrote letters, he managed his farms, and everything was accomplishments. He was a man of great, great accomplishments. The father was actually not primarily a planter, but he was a miner, iron ore mining, a new business in Virginia. And at one point, he had a first wife, a wonderful woman named Jane, and he made a trip to England to deliver his son, his first son, that's Lawrence Washington, to school where he himself had gone, the Appleby School in the northern part of England. And when he came back, he discovered that his wife had died. And he had a lawyer friend, George Erskine. And he told him that he had a possible new wife for him. And the wife came with a piece of land, a critical piece of land. Her land exactly adjoined Augustine Washington's land. It was a remarkable development, and she was a good-looking woman. She was very old. She was 23. If you were 23 at that time, it meant you were unmarriageable. Women were hooking up at 15, 16, commonly. So at 23, it meant something was very wrong, and there was something very wrong. But he married her, and George was the first child. Now, in my opinion, I'm going to try to differentiate between what is commonly established as facts and what is my opinion. So, in my opinion, what happened is that Augustine, the father, stayed away from the household because his wife was this relentless complainer, this relentlessly difficult woman. He was a nice man, Washington's father. He was a regular guy. We have descriptions of him. He's kind of blonde, big, and a friendly man. But he stayed away. So George grew up with the mother primarily there. And she was a very cold woman. And in my opinion, my view of the facts, she never hugged George Washington. She never said, "I love you." She just wasn't that way. The sad truth is that George Washington became famous when he was 18 for being sent by the British to the Ohio Valley to tell the French, get out of the Ohio Valley, it's British. And he came back and he wrote his journal about this, and the journal was published in London and other cities in Europe and in the United States. George Washington became famous when he was 18, and he became the president-elect when he was about 56. For that whole span of time, and his whole life, his mother never said one good word about him. There is no quote of any kind by anyone that she said something positive about her accomplished son. And he was a good son, but that's the way she was. So George Washington now had trouble getting close to people. He had getting close to men, and he had trouble being close to women. And this, he did though, when he was 6, his brother Lawrence came back from England. He was 14 years older, and George Washington bonded with his older half-brother Lawrence. And that was great for him. So he, unfortunately for George, but great for us, everything that happened to George was great to us because he was a great first president and a great man, and his accomplishments live on. He's not a distant figure. George Washington was the commander-in-chief of 10,000 officers in the Continental Army and over 200,000 men who rotated in and out, not at one time. He didn't directly control these men, but they all knew about the commander-in-chief. And he was a very reasonable man. He was a man who believed in due process. He was a man who believed in military justice. So, who he was, reasonable and social. The George Washington we know today from the dollar bill is an older man with dentures. Can you imagine wearing dentures from the 18th century, how that would make you feel? So the young George Washington was a happier man and a more smiling man. And anyway, he had trouble getting close. The marriage to, well, let me back up. Lawrence goes away and fights for the British in the Caribbean, and it's a disaster. Lawrence comes back, he's weakened by malaria, and he develops an opportunistic disease that we know today as tuberculosis. And Lawrence Washington fought with a hacking cough, but eventually he lost the fight. But before he lost the fight, he took George to Barbados, and they spent 40 days on the boat. Washington was with his tubercular brother in a cabin for more than 40 days, and when they got there, they shared a room in Barbados. Anyway, they say Washington had smallpox. He had a few pock marks on his face. But he also, some historians realize, as well as myself, that he came down with tuberculosis. He had both smallpox and tuberculosis. And one or the other rendered him infertile. So when he came back, he made a decision though. He had been a land surveyor. We know George Washington as the land surveyor. But when he came back, he never surveyed again. After all of these conversations with Lawrence, hearing about the war effort in the Caribbean, he decided to be a soldier. And when Lawrence came back, his next door neighbor were the Fairfaxes, the mighty Fairfaxes. And Lawrence and George became Fairfax men. Lawrence hooked up with the 16-year-old daughter of William Fairfax and married her. William Fairfax had a son, and the son was named George Fairfax. He was 7 years older than George Washington, but they became friends. And George Fairfax had a wife, Sally Fairfax, and George Washington developed a very serious crush on his friend's wife, Sally Fairfax. And he wrote a love letter to her at one point, after he met Martha. Martha brought about the meeting between George and herself. She laid a plan. She laid a honey trap. She was the honey. She was a very intelligent woman, Martha Washington. It's not given credit enough in my view, but she was a very intelligent and very nice lady. Anyway, she was a widow, a rich widow, the richest widow in Virginia, maybe the richest widow in all the colonies. And she timed when Washington would travel down to Williamsburg, and she knew that he had to come back over this ferry. So when he came back over the ferry, she was there. The ferry went over private property. She sent the owner of the private property down to Washington to say, come have dinner with us. At that time, they ate the big meal at 3 o'clock. So Washington gave in, and he stayed until dawn the next day. He discovered that Martha had cleared out the whole wing. There was nobody there but the two of them. Now, nobody knows what occurred. George Washington was not experienced in these things. But after that, George and Martha privately considered themselves engaged. They didn't denounce it, but they considered themselves engaged. He came back a week later, and then during this attack on the French, he wrote this love letter, really the most famous love letter in American history. It's called the Votary of Love letter. And he's writing it to Sally Fairfax. It's kind of written in code, so you don't know, is he talking about Sally or is he talking about Martha? But she ignored it, and he ended up marrying Martha and leaving the Virginia militia, marrying Martha, and leading an ordinary life there in the House of Burgesses, dancing, fox hunting, tobacco growing other crops, and they became best friends. George and Martha were best friends with Sally and George Fairfax. They were neighbors, adjoining neighbors, and best friends. But they had to be loyalists because of the property, and they eventually moved back to England. And George was deprived of this couple. Now, of course, during the years, undoubtedly, George and Martha tried to have children, but it wasn't happening because George was infertile. I mean, there's no test that says that, but he had smallpox. It's widely believed he also had tuberculosis, and they both, render people infertile, men infertile. So he then joins the Continental Army. He comes to the Continental Congress in his Virginia militia uniform, not his old uniform. He had a new uniform. And George Washington was 6'2", a little bit more than 6'2". So he's the only one in uniform. He's the only one with this kind of military experience. There was a few other men, older men who were experienced, but not like Washington. So the New Englanders wanted to bring in the Southerners into the battle against the British. So he's selected to be the commander-in-chief June 15th, 1775. And he goes up to Boston, and the war continues in Boston. Then he comes to New York. In in New York. There's an artillery unit led by Alexander Hamilton. After some battles, the disaster on Long Island, the Americans are pushed out of New York. They go to Fort Lee. The British cross the Hudson River, and they have to flee south. Washington doesn't stand and fight because he sees he can't fight. He becomes really a guerrilla fighter. And they're fleeing south to Pennsylvania to get away. And when he comes to the Raritan River, the British are stopped by a very effective artillery barrage. Washington realizes whoever's directing that artillery is a sharp person, and he then meets Alexander Hamilton. So Washington always wanted what he called penmen. That is, men who would take his ideas, make it into a letter, then he would read the letter, edit the letter, and sign the letter. He got up before dawn, writing letters. Now he's the commander-in-chief. He's writing orders, he's writing letters. So he had these aides de camp. And Arthur Lefkowitz, a New Jersey author, wrote this very interesting book on all of the aides de camp that Washington had. So Washington immediately brought Hamilton in to be one of his aides de camp. And Hamilton fit in very nicely. And because he's a very aggressive personality, Hamilton becomes like kind of the leader of the group. But there's no friction. Everybody's working together nicely. So they worked together for 4 years, Hamilton and Washington. But Hamilton and Washington never become close. Washington he never talks about himself. He never reveals any secrets. He's a reserved man. And if you don't want to talk about your own personal life, you don't ask about other people's personal lives, you see? So Washington would talk about agriculture. He loved agriculture. He loved to talk about dogs and horses and tobacco and weed. And he read 10 newspapers a day. He was talking about world affairs. And of course, he was talking about the British and the king, and plenty to talk about, but it wasn't personal. So now this lecture, The Battle of the Founders, could also be called How Madison Went from Being a Washington Man to an Anti-Washington Man. This question is not asked, that people don't even realize that Madison was a Washington man. So now, during the war, Alexander Hamilton meets Elizabeth Schuyler and connects with her and marries her. Just as a point of interest, he doesn't invite General Washington to the marriage up the Hudson. But his father-in-law, General Daniel Schuyler, who's Dutch, as is Elizabeth Schuyler, the Dutch had different views of sexuality than the British. So I'm mentioning this because undoubtedly Hamilton and Elizabeth had relations before they got married, because Daniel Schuyler and his wife also had to get married years before. Anyway, Daniel Schuyler had his 15th child, and he invited the Washingtons to be the godparents. So he kind of made nice. He made the situation nice by inviting the Washingtons to the christening. Anyway, after the war in the North was over, and the British tried to win the war then in the South. And there was a great battle, the Battle of Cowpens, which preceded the Battle of Yorktown. And the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina was a great victory for General Daniel Morgan. And it was such a crushing victory that everybody kind of realized the whole war is over. And Cornwallis went to Yorktown to hook up with the British Navy, and the French blocked it, and Washington came down with Rochambeau, and they took over, they had a siege at Yorktown, and the British gave up, and that was really the end of the fighting. But Hamilton realized that the fighting was over. he left. He left when he had a fight with Washington. He picked the fight with Washington. Washington told him, Hamilton, you've been keeping me waiting. And Hamilton said, now this is after Hamilton was married. You see, before he was married, he didn't have any family. Now he has a wife, a wonderful wife. He's ready for a break. So he says, if you're gonna, if you don't like me, we must part. Washington tried to make nice, but Hamilton said, I'll stay 2 weeks and then I'm going. And they broke apart. Now, what happened was that when Hamilton heard that Washington and Rochambeau were marching down, he came back and he said to Washington, let me join the fighting. You kept me in the office. I wanted glory. Please, let me lead part of the fighting at Yorktown. Now, this is the way Washington was. He didn't say, you left me. He forgave him. Okay? He was a very forgiving guy, Washington. And Hamilton came in, took part in the fighting, got glory, and was very happy. So the war is over, and Washington, the British took New York. They left New York on November 25th, which was known as Evacuation Day. And Washington brought his officers to Fraunces Tavern and said, I'm leaving the army. And he cried. He really cried. All the men cried. It was a very emotional scene. And then Washington went to Annapolis, where the Articles of Confederation had morphed into the the Continental Congress had morphed into the Articles of Confederation Congress. Before the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation. So he met them in Maryland, and he handed in his commission, and again he cried, and he said, this is it, I'm leaving public life. I'm leaving public life. And everybody cried, and they had a great dinner, and he went down to Mount Vernon. So now it's the period after the war, and there's problems. There's problems with Shays' Rebellion up in Massachusetts, which was very difficult to put down. An army officer with debts that the farmers had, the banks were foreclosing, and the veterans say, you should give us a break, and this isn't right. So it seemed like there were going to be, that the 13 colonies might not hang together. There were always talks of the British forming an alliance with New England and things like this. It was a dangerous time. So people began to write Washington and say, we need to have a reform of the Articles of Confederation. So one of the people doing this was Madison. Young James Madison had met Washington. And where Madison lived in Virginia, Montpelier, Mount Vernon was on the way from Philadelphia and New York. So Madison became a visitor at Mount Vernon, and he was very welcomed by Washington. And little by little, Madison became Washington's closest political advisor and friend. He was a Washington man, and he was pushing Washington at Mount Vernon. You have to lead the meeting in Philadelphia. You have to be there. And Washington said, look, I got up and I said I retired from public life. How could I go back on my word? But Madison was there. Other people were writing Washington, but Madison was there at his table, his friend, and he pushed him and pushed him. And then Washington agreed, I'll go. I'll go to Philadelphia, which we know today is the Constitutional Convention. So Madison got there first. To show you how close they were, Washington writes Madison and says, get me lodgings. He was his political aide, and he helped him personally. So now the Constitutional Convention takes place, and Madison comes with a whole plan, which was adopted by the Virginia delegation as the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan really forms the basis of the Constitution. Not all of it, but the division of powers, three co-equal branches of government. These are James Madison's ideas. And he was one of the biggest speakers of the Constitution. Then it had to be ratified, the Constitution. And Madison went down to Virginia and led the ratification fight. And who was opposed to the ratification? Patrick Henry, the great orator. James Madison had a way of speaking. He wasn't a great orator, but he was very reasonable, very logical, and very effective in communicating his ideas. And at the end, the Virginia Convention voted to ratify. So Patrick Henry was mad about that. 2 senators were supposed to be selected from each state to be part of the new Senate. Patrick Henry wouldn't let Madison be one of the senators. Madison had to run for the House of Representatives, and he ran. And Patrick Henry selected James Monroe, the Revolutionary War hero, to run against him. And they traveled together, Madison and Monroe, in a civil way, debated. It happened during the winter. Madison always said he got frostbite in his nose. There was a numb spot. Anyway, he won. Of course, Washington was secretly helping Madison. So James Madison won the election and came to New York, the first capital, went to Congress, and partly because he was connected to Washington, and partly because he was just a very intelligent, a very persuasive political guy, he became the leader of the House of Representatives. To show you how close it was, Washington had Madison write the president's greeting to the first Congress. Welcome to New York, first Congress. May you have a great legislative session. James Madison then answered himself. James Madison wrote as the message from the House of Representatives back to the president. Thank you for your greeting, Mr. President. We're happy to be here. Good luck to you too. So now Washington has to select the cabinet. And he selects, it's suggested to Washington, take Alexander Hamilton. James Madison approves of Alexander Hamilton. James Madison approves of the other Senate, the other cabinet officers, including Thomas Jefferson. Now, where is Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson had been the governor of Virginia, 2 one-year terms. But at the end of his term, the British came and attacked. And Jefferson had to run for his life on horseback. And the rest of the House of Burgesses had to run too. Well, the legislature went this way. And instead of joining the legislature, Thomas Jefferson joined his family and abandoned the legislature. Now, Thomas Jefferson said, well, actually, my governorship ended on June 2nd, and this was June 3rd. So my term as governor had ended. And they said, you're a rat. And Patrick Henry and his allies caused the legislature to convene an inquiry into the acts of Thomas Jefferson. And by the time the inquiry was held, Yorktown had come and gone. And it was a great success, and everybody was feeling good. So they never pursued Thomas Jefferson. They just forgot about it. I mean, he came there ready to defend himself, but they didn't bring up the charges. They didn't have hearings. They just said, thanks for your service. And the defenders of Thomas Jefferson, you see, they said, thanks for your service. as if he hadn't abandoned them. I mean, the facts are the facts. He abandoned the legislature and went and joined his family. Thomas Jefferson was a self-interested guy. That is the story of Thomas Jefferson. When he wrote in the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you can understand it by saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of my happiness, my personal happiness. And that's what he was concerned with. Great food, great wine, and women. Mm-hmm. So he was really washed up after this governorship, which ended in this bad way for him. But he had a friendship with Madison. And something happened during his friendship with Madison, which would help us understand the context of what happened later. And that is that in Philadelphia, this is before the Constitution, when Madison was a member of that Articles of Confederation Congress. Madison was at a nursing home, a famous upscale nursing home in Philadelphia. And who was there but William Floyd? That's exit 68 on the expressway, if you know anything about the Long Island Expressway. I guess you guys don't know it. But anyway, William Floyd was a famous New Yorker, and he had a 16-year-old daughter named Kitty, who was hot stuff. But Madison was there with the Floyds, and everything was kind of normal. Then Jefferson came to the same boarding house to be with his friend Madison, and Jefferson took one look at this 16-year-old and said, wow, she's perfect for you. Now Madison was 32. Kitty Floyd was 15, 16. But Jefferson led the conversation, got Kitty Floyd, caught up in the whole thing there with famous Madison, Jefferson. But right after Jefferson left, Kitty Floyd agreed to marry 32-year-old James Madison. It was extraordinary. But after Jefferson left, Kitty Floyd and her father left, and as soon as she left, she broke off the engagement. But that was like the high point, the romantic high point of James Madison's life, until years later. Now, so Thomas Jefferson gets himself appointed to be the ambassador to France, and he has a great time in France. Nobody ever had a better time in Europe than Thomas Jefferson. Again the food, again the wine, again the women. And one of the women, of course, is 14-year-old Sally Hemings, that he brings from Virginia, ostensibly to accompany his daughter. So anyway, Thomas Jefferson is in France, and they start convening the Philadelphia Convention. And Thomas Jefferson knows that the convention is going on. Madison writes him, and other people write him, but he doesn't come running back or anything. He doesn't come back one day early. He stays the full 5 years. And he's, of course, we know now through the DNA that Sally Hemings became the mother of 6. She had 6 pregnancies. One of them took place there in France. It's extraordinary. Thomas Jefferson, in my view, is supported by, over the 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries, by a vast number of Southern historians, Southern writers, who say, oh, what a great man he was, what a great man he was. How important was the Declaration of Independence, and, they overlook everything that he did. They say, oh, that's what people did back then, But Nobody else brought their teenage slave to Europe. And he not only brought her, but he had to coach her. You know, don't act as if you're just the enslaved person. Thomas Jefferson never made any speeches. He didn't want to make speeches, and he wasn't good at making speeches. But he was great one-on-one. One-on-one at a dinner party, he made fabulous conversation. So Washington saw that his fellow Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, that he generally got along with, was there, getting all of this European experience, and he and Madison decided that Jefferson should be the first Secretary of State. So Jefferson eventually comes back and accepts the offer and comes to New York. But by the time he gets to New York, Hamilton has been the Secretary of Treasury for about 8 months. So when Hamilton became the Secretary of the Treasury, he immediately went to work establishing the credit of the United States. I think the second day he was in office, he borrowed $50,000 from a bank, you know, and he hired people. He was in charge of the Coast Guard, collecting the tariffs. They were appointing the customs agents. In those times, the customs agents would get a percentage of all the taxes that he picked up. So it was lucrative jobs, not that Hamilton ever abused it, but he was building an empire of employees. He was really the Prime Minister of the United States. And Jefferson comes finally to New York, and he sees that Hamilton has all of this power. So, but at the time that Jefferson first gets to New York, which is in March of 1790, Madison is getting along with Washington. Madison is getting along with Hamilton. Everybody's getting along with everybody. It's wonderful. Now, what Jefferson does, as soon as he gets to New York, is he rents a house on Maiden Lane. And he immediately, it's a rented house, and he immediately hires workmen to fix it up. A rented house, and everybody knew that the capital wasn't going to stay in New York. And Adams writes in his diary, "I can't believe that Jefferson is going into debt renovating his house. I thought he learned his lesson back in Paris." Now, Jefferson was in debt his entire adult life. But there's a very particular story about how he got into debt. Jefferson had a wife, Martha Wales Jefferson. And her father, John Wales, was an attorney totally in the slave business. And he acquired 120 slaves. And one of them was Sally Hemings' mother, Elizabeth Hemings. Elizabeth Hemings was a beautiful baby. And her father was a British sea captain. And the sea captain wanted his baby and was willing to pay for her. But John Wales, being a first-class creep, wouldn't sell the man his own child. The sea captain actually had a plan to kidnap his daughter, but it fell through, and he disappeared. But Wales, you know, these Virginia men, I mean, it wasn't a secret to anybody that they were having sex with the female slaves. It was practically universal. Now, by the way, when Washington grew up with his very difficult mother, I don't believe that the mother allowed anybody to go down to the slave quarters and try to have sex with the Washington slaves. And later on at Mount Vernon, there are no stories about Washington or any of the hundreds and hundreds, thousands of guests going down to the slave quarters. Washington, they don't want to say nice things about Washington because it's somewhat politically incorrect. But I believe he respected the female slaves on his estates, and that was just not allowed. That's not to say that it didn't happen, but it was like entirely consensual. It wasn't at all, any kind of overreaching. Right? Anyway, Jefferson, as the son-in-law, he had the choice. He could accept his father-in-law's estate with the assets and with the debts, or he could reject it and be finished with it. Well, the assets were 120 slaves, including Elizabeth, including baby Sally, and obviously John Wales had an eye for attractive slaves. He was in the business. And Jefferson took all of the, actually it was a split, it was a three-way split with two other sons-in-law. Jefferson took his share of the slaves and his share of the debts, and he was never out of debt again. He was in debt his entire life to the very end. And the debts just went up and up. The man loved wine. He used to import 600 bottles a year of French wine. During his first term as president, he spent $7,500 on wine. An extraordinary sum. So he bought books. He bought expensive books. And he never stopped his expensive lifestyle. The Southern historians would love to say, well, look, when he was 80, he had morality. And he realized his slaves are going to have to be sold, and he should cut down. No, there's no break. Kept the high lifestyle up. When he finally died, it was 1826, his slaves had to be sold in the worst way. The families broken up. A horrible thing. Some of them shipped, down the river to Alabama. It was a horrible, horrible thing. And Jefferson knew it was coming. It's not like, it was some kind of a secret or there was a plan. He had plans to get out of debt. One of the things that he did is he sold his books to the Congress for $24,000. An enormous sum, but it still didn't, wipe out his debts. So Jefferson arrives in New York. He renovates his rented house there on Maiden Lane. He's brought back James Heming, Sally Heming's brother, who's been trained to be a French chef. And he starts inviting everybody over for the 3 o'clock meal. And it's a great meal. Now, Washington was also serving great meals. But the conversation with Washington was always stilted. You just couldn't easily tell an off-color joke in front of Washington. And you couldn't say things that, would have political ramifications. I hate England, I hate France, But Jefferson's, it was mostly men, not all men, but mostly men, and they could speak their mind. They could speak about science, they could speak about sex, they could speak about politics. So, in my view, James Madison is drawn to Jefferson and drawn to being at Jefferson's rental home there. And of course, Madison remembers what happened with Kitty Floyd, that Jefferson had brought about his one romantic connection. So he bonds with Jefferson in a very deep way. And Washington was never close, just couldn't cross a certain barrier in terms of loyalty and, a feeling of togetherness, brotherliness, whatever you want to call it. So Jefferson, one of the issues was the formation of a national bank and a national judiciary. Now let's remember, Jefferson is a debtor. A debtor doesn't want an independent federal judiciary. Now there's going to be federal judges. Jefferson had the state courts kind of controlled. They were letting his debts pile up. But what if a debtor went into federal court and got a judgment? It might completely wipe him out during his lifetime. So Jefferson, for a variety of reasons, but I believe personal reasons, wanted a weak central government. And so, now Madison was not Jefferson's protege. He was his co-equal. James Madison was a man of great intellect, of great learning. But when you eat at a man's table, and you're with a man, day after day, you know, you become affected by the way he thinks, and they began to think alike. I mean, there was no dispute between Jefferson and Madison. Now, Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, he wasn't a diplomatic guy. He was a very forceful guy. And he put forth these plans, a financial plan, and then he went right to the House of Representatives and lobbied for his plans. Today, the Secretary of the Treasury doesn't do that. It's like the House's prerogative. But Hamilton didn't have these bounds like, he had an idea and his ideas were great and everybody should vote for his ideas. Jefferson didn't want this confrontation. He was a sneaky guy, Jefferson, but to your face, he would just yes you. Then later on, he'd work against you. So now Washington's first term comes to an end. And Washington has had enough. Washington had never wanted to be the president. Washington had wanted to be the commander-in-chief. Remember, his older brother Lawrence was a soldier. Now he became a soldier, and he won the war. But they asked him to come to Philadelphia, where he led the Constitutional Convention. And then they voted for him. So what could he do? He had to be the president. Now the guy came down to Mount Vernon with the vote. He came down on April 15th, and he knocked on the door. He said, General Washington, you've been elected the president. Now, he is the first guy elected the first president. You'd think the guy would invite in his friends, his neighbors. We're going to have a party, and then I'm going to go to New York. No. The guy comes on April 14th. On April 15th, Washington goes down to visit his mother. He goes to visit his mother, who has nothing nice to say. We don't know what she said, but he just says, I'm going to be the president. Maybe this was an opportunity for her to say congratulations, but he doesn't say she said that. And there's no party that we've ever heard of. There's no champagne. He just starts traveling up to New York, where he's greeted royally on the whole trip up. Everyone's applauding him and putting flowers on his hair and cheering him by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. So he's had enough at the end of the first term. But everybody says, Madison says, Hamilton says, Jefferson, you gotta run for a second term. So when he starts the second term, all of a sudden Jefferson quits as the Secretary of State. And Jefferson and Madison form the Republican Party. And they do it so quietly, so sneakily. Thomas Jefferson is a very, very brilliant guy. If you read about Thomas Jefferson, don't think he's on a level, a very high level, and he's a very deceptive guy. He's a crafty guy. He knew that every word that he wrote in every paragraph would be looked at by historians, so he was very careful about what he wrote. He could never write a biography because it would give people information. In fact, everybody writes how he cracked up after his wife died. He then proceeded to tear up all their personal correspondence. All of her letters to him, he tore them up because he didn't want any clues. Any clues. It's even worse than that, because Sally Hemings her father and Martha's father, they had the same father, that creep, John Wales. They were half-sisters. Thomas Jefferson took up with his half-sister after his wife died. But there's no portrait of a Martha Wales Jefferson. They always had a portrait. The guy was a slave attorney. We have his portrait. I suspect that Jefferson realized he couldn't have the picture there. People would say, oh, look at that. Sally looks just like that woman. So he just couldn't hide it. He destroyed it. That's what I believe. And then he came up with the biggest lie, I think, in American history. After his wife died, he said, oh, she asked me to promise to never remarry. What wife in American history or world history ever said to her husband, oh, don't remarry, just be single? But he said it, and nobody really ever challenged him on it particularly, because they just let, all the Southern historians, let him get away with everything. So.
But he had Sally Jennings.
Yes, Hemings. Yes, but yes.
But
that was hidden. That was hidden.
Yeah.
He was married to Sally Hemings.
Oh, really?
I mean,
yeah.
He was bonded with her.
Oh.
About 5 years ago, they discovered her bedroom, which was right down the hall from his bedroom. So they could be together, and then she could wake up in her own bedroom, theoretically. I went to Monticello a couple of years ago, and they make a very big deal of Sally Hemings, which is good, which is absolutely, the right thing to do. So, Madison went. Now, the last thing that happened between Madison and Madison got married to Dolly, and who became Dolly Madison, and that was in 1794. Madison had spent 9 years being a Washington man, and when he married Dolly, Washington gave it their blessing, and everything was good. But after that, what happened is that Washington had sent John Jay to England to renegotiate a treaty with the British. It's called the Jay Treaty. And Jay came back with the treaty. And Washington, it was controversial. It was controversial because the British were the kings of the Atlantic Ocean, and he was negotiating from a point of view of weakness, and he did the best he could. But Jefferson, who in my view really wanted to be the president, you see, he never wrote one word, Jefferson, oh, I would be a good president. Oh, I should be the president. Or so-and-so asked me to be the president. Not a word. He writes thousands and thousands of letters, and he never says that he lusts in any way for the presidency. But lo and behold, as soon as the election of 1796 is scheduled, he's running for the presidency under the Republican Party, this mysterious Republican Party which appears. So Jefferson had led, let me go back to the Jay Treaty. So Madison, who was the head of the House of Representatives, said, oh, the Jay Treaty has these clauses, which are commercial clauses. So we, the House of Representatives, we should see all the documents about those clauses. Now, Washington knew that if the Senate and the House had to approve a treaty would never get approved. And Washington knew from his own memory that this exact point had been debated at the Constitutional Convention. And it was voted that only the Senate would approve a treaty. Washington went back to his documents and found the vote, his notes on the vote, that said only the Senate shall approve a treaty. And he filed it with the Department of State. And that ended the debate. And after that, Washington broke off his relationship with Madison. So that's how the story of Madison being a Washington man to an anti-Washington man. I think I'm going to conclude there. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you.
Any questions from the peanut gallery? Yes.
Go ahead.
While Jefferson was in France, wasn't he the person that put through the Canal du Midi that went from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean?
No, I don't believe so. I'm not familiar with that.
That's what we were told when we were on the Canal du Midi.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That he, I don't know if he orchestrated or whether he had the plans, but.
To do what? I'm
To
sorry.
Canal.
There's a canal called the Canal du Midi that runs from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. And it's a series of locks and canals all the way through the country because it was for transportation. And I mean, it's still there.
And what did they tell you?
I'm sorry?
What did they tell you in France?
That Jefferson was somehow involved with the Canal du Midi.
He probably took a
Maybe
cruise.
he signed the okay for it.
No, I'll look it up, but it's not well known as one of his activities. I know he toured a lot of vineyards.
Whatever happened to Sally Heming after Jefferson passed away?
Yes. So he had promised her, you know, according to her sons, the sons were interviewed, Madison and Elson, and that their children would be free, and he freed them on his death. He did free them. Now, Sally he couldn't free Sally, because that would stand out too much. He didn't promise to free her, he promised to free the children. So she was given her time. That means she was set free, not free. She was just allowed to live in Charlottesville in a house, you know, independently. And they even know the location of the house. But she lived there quietly, I guess with her sons. The sons eventually went west, two of the sons, Madison, and the other one starts with an E. And she was the head of the household, you know, when she was with Jefferson. She was around the house. She never came to New York, she never came to the White House. So he had a certain amount of restraint in that regard. Yes?
I do recall reading that Jefferson and Heming's children were passed off as white.
Yes.
We were.
They had like, maybe they were 1/8 black, but they passed off as
The
white
mother
since
Elizabeth was half black. The Sally was a quarter black.
quarter
And the children were an eighth.
and eighth.
Yeah. So they did pass for
So
white.
freeing them was not an issue, they just passed as white.
Well, technically, under Virginia law, you couldn't free your slave.
Right, but they didn't know they were slaves.
Oh, they were treated as slaves. They were his slaves, his children.
Yeah.
After his death.
1/8 black was sufficient to make you slave.
Yeah.
Yes, but I read that they passed off as white
Several of them
for
did.
appearance.
Yes.
They did. And some of them fought in the Civil War. They have pictures of some of the descendants. They look like, you know, handsome white men. One of the descendants went to California, became famous. Yeah, famous California person. Don't you have a question, ma'am?
I have a question.
Yes, Senator?
It's just been so interesting. It's just been fascinating.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I watched Hamilton about 6 times.
Yes.
So I enjoyed it. I never got the impression that Thomas Jefferson had a background like you just described.
Oh, I appreciate that. I'm
You're
not
live
gonna go.
streaming this, does that mean it'll be
On
recorded
YouTube,
for
I think it will be,
on-demand?
I think it will be posted on YouTube. You know, maybe in a day or 2 or 3.
You said very interestingly, Jan, that Washington became, later in his military career, a guerrilla fighter. And I'm thinking of a parallel, historical parallel. Did the United States lose the Vietnam War, or were they beaten by superior guerrilla tactics by North Vietnam? And as it relates to your lecture, did the Continental Army win the war, or did the British Army and Navy lose the war? The War of Independence, the
Well, they
Revolutionary
made a
War.
very big effort, the British. You know, they made a very, very big effort, spending a lot of money and a lot of troops and hiring German troops, you know. I mean, it was because of George III. but
What
never
I'm
gave up.
asking is, was it a botch job? Did they botch it?
I wouldn't say it's, that they botched it, they tried, but, you know, it was kind of far away from,
So you're giving
From England.
General George Washington a lot of credit for the victory.
Yes.
well, he sustained the effort, he kept
Yes.
at it, he wouldn't give up. And,
Both as a tactician and as a.
Well, if you look at his crossing of the Delaware, it was a brilliant, extremely courageous move that changed the course of the war. He was a brilliant general.
he's not you know, a brilliant tactician. He tried.
But a very strong leader. He kept the army together.
Exactly as you say. He was a great leader. And when they crossed the Delaware, it took a lot of leadership for the men to be quiet, for the men to be freezing, and then they attacked with great spirit. He built a family, you know, a spirited military family who, when the Hessians saw the way the Americans were fighting, it overwhelmed them because they were fighting with such spirit, his spirit.
I would say that if anyone is interested in reading about the founding fathers, the author Joseph Ellis writes beautifully about this topic. He's written several books. Joseph Ellis.
Well, the big
ELLIS.
news is that in November, PBS will have a special, a 6-day special on the American Revolution, Ken Burns.
Oh.
Okay, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you.
for coming.
Very,